Welcome to Secret Art of Space-Time, a podcast about ideas, culture, and spirituality. My name is Andy. I hope you enjoy this show. Hello. So this episode is going to be political and probably a little intense. And I'm saying that now because this is a quote-unquote trigger warning. If you're not up for intensity, if you're not up for politics, if you're not up for really directly addressing some of the effed up shit going on, then, maybe now is not the time for this episode. I shared something in 2023, November 2023, around what I thought about the situation. And I stand by what I said there. Maybe I'll link in the show notes to what I wrote at the time. I did receive a little bit of pushback at the time for calling what was happening a genocide. And at the time, I just left it. I didn't argue the point. I just stood by what I'd said. I hope that 2 years on, people can see that that is what has been going on and that that was the intent from the beginning. The reason I felt confident in calling it that from the beginning is because of some of the things that Netanyahu was saying way back when, 2 years ago in October of 2023. He'd made multiple comments, but one in particular in which he referenced a passage from the Bible, which is clearly genocidal. It's so horrible that I don't feel comfortable even quoting it, but you obviously can do a Google search and find what he said and what the passage of the Bible he was referring to says. But it was clear to me anyway from the beginning that his intent and the intent of the state of Israel was genocidal. And according to the definition of genocide, the intent towards genocide is enough to call it genocidal. And I think it is important to call it that as soon as there is the intent for it, because that makes more possible the galvanizing of, the international community to do something about it. It is insane that it has been going on this long, and obviously it did not start in 2023, but also obviously it's been much more intense since then, right? And it is just insane that it's been going on like this. But also, it's not surprising. It's both insane and just so horrific. I truly don't have words. It's so disgusting. I actually can't go too deep into how I feel about it because it's like I can feel the intense rage beginning to surface from my gut. And I will again become incoherent if I feel too deeply into that. It's insane and horrific, but not surprising. It's not surprising because of the past actions of the state of Israel. It's not surprising because this kind of mentality lies at the heart of the logic of the West. And this is not to say that, the West is evil and the rest of the world is pure. That's not my point. But obviously the West has been in power, has dominated on the world stage, and obviously they have done so with a logic of genocide. This isn't an anomaly. This is how the world order has been operating. And it's as if they've laid their cards on the table. This kind of behavior isn't new. It's just that it's out in the open now, more so than it was. Obviously there's a long history of violence, of genocide, of oppression, of colonization. But for a long time, there was at least an attempt to dress it up in politics. Obviously, there's still an attempt to do that now, but it's just so obvious. You actually have to be delusional to think that what the state of Israel is doing is justified. And I don't entirely blame those who are delusional, because there has been a very intense multi-generational campaign of brainwashing, literal brainwashing, to convince Jews in particular that this kind of behavior is required for their safety. And of course, there are Jews that are complicit. And obviously, there are many Jews who have spoken out against it. But there's also a way in which Jews have been used, right? As I wrote in that original post, trauma has been weaponized over generations. Because obviously what's going on now, it's horrific for Palestinians, but it's also obviously not serving the interests of Jewish people. I keep saying obviously because it seems so obvious, and I suspect that most of my listeners are on board, but, I suppose it's not obvious to everyone. And this is the state of the world where it's how do we go forward when so many people see things so completely differently? We really are living in different worlds. At some point, logic and argument feels pointless, because it's just seems so apparent that, for example, this use of the idea of antisemitism has been so distorted, and used to justify horrendous actions. And this idea that to criticize the state of Israel is anti-Semitic, that's so effed up. And obviously wrong. It just seems so obvious that Jewish people cannot be equated to the state of Israel. And I know that there's this propaganda that the state of Israel is for protecting Jewish people, but can't we see now that that is not what it's for? How is what's going on good for Jewish people? And at any rate, I think as a general rule, we should distinguish between people and states. And we have every right to criticize the actions of a state, particularly one that is engaging in a genocide. Obvious. It's obvious. There's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing the state of Israel. Now, I keep wanting to say obviously, and then I try to censor myself, but it's just so fucking obvious. God, it's so obvious that even though the vast majority of claims to anti-Semitism in the media are false and distortions, it's also obvious that anti-Semitism still exists. And honestly, I think this whole thing is anti-Semitic. I think the state of Israel is the most anti-Semitic in its actions. In claiming that this has anything to do with Jewish people, I think that claim is anti-Semitic. And I know that there are many Jewish people who are on board, but obviously there are also many who are not. So I'm not trying to exonerate everyone from complicity. But I do think it's important not to dismiss the extent of indoctrination and propaganda and brainwashing and coercion involved in making people complicit. And yes, people are still responsible for their own behavior. Both of those are true. But nevertheless, I do think that enacting a genocide and saying that it's to protect Jews is anti-Semitic. It's harmful to Jews. Obviously, it's more harmful to Palestinians. Coming back to what I was saying earlier about Netanyahu quoting the Bible, quoting a genocidal passage of the Bible, I think that's actually quite relevant. The deep history here is relevant. Western civilization has so much to do with that part of the world. I mean, aren't we seeing the logical conclusion of patriarchy? Isn't that what this is? Isn't this what results from millennia of a worldview which has explicitly sought to erase the feminine and put forward a metaphysics in which the masculine is dominant over the feminine? What does this have to do with the feminine? Someone might ask. Isn't this a clear case of oppressor versus the oppressed? But doesn't that result from a worldview? And I think even worldview is too cognitive a term, because we've so deeply ingested this kind of worldview that it is precognitive. And, most of us either engage in it unconsciously or are going to great lengths to consciously heal from it. But if the feminine is the principle of relationality, if the feminine is care, compassion, feeling, then isn't that what is missing? Isn't this a case of, being completely cut off from the heart, from our relationship to other people, even and especially those who are different from us? Although truly, probably not all that different at the end of the day. I mean, to believe the utter nonsense, to believe wholeheartedly in Zionism to the point of being willing to enact a genocide and not even being able to see that that's what you're doing. I think that's the kind of thing that can result from being so in the mind and so disconnected from the body and the heart. Because at that point, the mind can actually justify anything. You can tell a just so story about literally anything if you are cut off from the heart. You can cherry pick facts from history. You can tell lies. You can fabricate all kinds of stories to justify literally anything. And that's the state of mind that can result only, I think, from intense trauma. Trauma that is then weaponized. So there's been this patriarchal dominant mode that has been amplified and trained through the monotheistic religions. But there was a different belief system at the root of all of those. It's not like Jews are inherently patriarchal. And I spoke about it in my episode. Oh, there's a garbage truck outside making noise. In my episode, Sacred Matrix, I spoke about evidence for Jewish folk customs and sort of the religion or beliefs of the people that were quite different from the more codified and sanctioned religion as particularly expressed in the Old Testament in this case, right? So, if we can imagine, in the days when people were putting together the books of the Bible, like obviously, again, it seems very obvious that there would have been a politics involved in selecting what texts would make it into the canon, right? Obviously, some people had vested interests in ensuring that certain stories were sanctioned and certain stories were not, or that stories were told in a particular way. And there is archaeological evidence for there being worship of a goddess, not just a god, among Jews, like pre-Christianity. Now, I'm saying all this because I want to really emphasize that what I'm about to say is not a critique of Jews, it's a critique of patriarchy. If you look at the Old Testament, there are some very violent passages in the Bible, and there are some very questionable things that the supposed God, Yahweh, stated. He was clearly and explicitly a vengeful and jealous and violent God. And, in a similar vein to certain Gnostics, I would question whether that is the one true God. Is that truly a being we wish to worship? One who espouses genocide? This is not a critique of Jews. There are many Jewish people who don't worship that God, or who, have maintained or revived more folk customs that aren't so patriarchal. But I actually think that this kind of thing, this kind of question is really at the heart of what we're seeing playing out now, and really at the heart of the West. It's not insignificant that many people worship a violent God. And, if you're secular, it might seem insignificant because if you believe that such beings don't exist, then it's sort of incidental as to who believes what, to some extent anyway. But, for those of us who see ourselves as spiritual, who believe that there are beings out there, and many of them, then it becomes a very important question as to which beings we worship, or really whether we want to worship beings at all. I think worship itself is part of the problem here, but I think that's maybe a topic for another day. But once you inhabit a more animist worldview, or a spiritual worldview, and I think we might see spirituality literally as a belief in spirits, right? As a belief in, it's not just the beings that we can see, but there are many other beings that exist as well, and that, impact our lives here. And once you open up that reality, then we have to acknowledge that there are many different kinds of beings, and some may have our best interest at heart and others probably won't, right? Because the spirit world is diverse as humanity is, and we can't just simply trust all spirits just because maybe they seem to have some powers that we don't, being here in bodies. But is it possible that much of the West has been operating on this principle of worshiping a violent God who's not truly the one true God? Has there been some kind of spiritual deal made almost? Has this been a sort of political long con? Has the control of people's spirituality through controlling what texts are canonized and who holds spiritual authority? Has this been a way to control and manipulate people to serve the few who seek inordinate power? And this obviously isn't just about Jewish people, right? This includes Christians. This includes many people who don't see themselves as religious at all, but have inherited certain belief systems and structures that bow to violence. I also don't think anything is simple, and obviously, perhaps, there are many passages in the Bible, even in the Old Testament, that are wise, that, haven't been distorted, right? The distortions are mixed up with the truth. So some people will say it's anti-Semitic of me to say so, but actually I think that in some ways Jews have been used. They've been used as pawns. And again, many are complicit and many are not, but I do think that much of what is done and is being done in the name of Jews is itself anti-Semitic. It's really throwing Jews under the bus. To enact a genocide in the name of anyone is obviously to make them a target. Now, in saying that, I also might be accused of, trying to make Jews the victim here when obviously they're not. So, obviously, free Palestine. Most people are not extreme. Most people are not extremists, but extreme views can be found on both quote-unquote sides. And there is a dynamic where when one side is behaving so extremely as the state of Israel is, there can be this feeling that we have to meet that with the opposite extreme. And the opposite extreme is the idea that somehow all Jews are responsible for what's happening, or that all Israelis are, or that somehow supporting Hamas is a good idea. So, the issue with slogans, perhaps, is that others will assume what you mean by it. And often they'll assume the worst. And while the state of Israel and those other states who have supported them or not stood up to them are truly the ones responsible, and is really where the majority of our focus should be, I think that in the interest of nuance, maybe it is worth going just a little bit into some of the views held by the left. And I'm not talking about the neoliberal moderate left, which has just cowardly stood behind Israel in this case. I did find that the stance that the more radical left took in response to this to be quite disturbing. I'm connected by various degrees of separation to some more radical communities where I live, and there were certain voices in my community, not my close friends, but my sort of broader community, who celebrated and supported the Hamas attack and who aligned themselves with Hamas. And there were many people who maybe didn't take that stance explicitly, but did support those who did. It's terrifying the way the state of Israel has tentacles everywhere and will truly dox people who, speak out against the state of Israel. And that's really disgusting. The way that they can exert their power across the globe in that way. and often in a way that's truly uncalled for, right? That is really punishing people who are making very warranted critiques against the state of Israel. And so I certainly don't support that kind of doxing and that kind of violent enforcement of empire. And yet, in response to that, or in reaction to that kind of behavior on the part of like Israeli organizations operating outside the state of Israel, there were a lot of people who ended up standing behind people who were explicitly celebrating Hamas, the Hamas attack. And I was really dismayed. Like, it's expected that there are going to be sort of younger, more radical, more just like less nuanced expressions of the left. We should expect that. But I truly witnessed very intelligent, more mature, professional people. There was a widespread, unquestioning support for and celebration of the Hamas attack among the more radical left, you could say. Not even radical in some cases, like among, again, we were, facing the limit of the usefulness of these terms left and right, because like, I'm not talking about extremists. I'm not talking about like the liberal left, but I don't know what you would say, like the academic left. And while that attack was understandable and to be expected given the past behavior of the state of Israel and its colonial project, I did find that the celebration of it was quite disgusting. And why am I talking about this now when that happened 2 years ago? And what's more important is the actual genocide taking place? Because I think it's really important when we're taking a stand to be nuanced and careful in our perspective and not simply kind of conform. Like, there is a certain conformity even among academics to take a particular view rather unquestioningly, if I may say so. And that is not helpful. Like, we need nuance and we need to sift through these things in order to create positive change. Truly, I think that kind of attitude has only contributed to this issue going on and on and on, because it gives ammunition to those who want to weaponize antisemitism. Because while the vast majority of people standing in solidarity with Palestine probably are more nuanced, I would like to believe, and I fully support, the student protests and the people who have courageously stood in their own truth and have done a lot of incredible organizing work. And, divestment is important. So this is not a critique of, a mass of people. But I did find this view also to be rather prominent. This idea that widespread violence against any Israeli is not just justified, but is called for. And, the argument goes that simply by being a citizen of Israel, you're complicit. All Israelis have to join the army, so they're all viable targets. Let's look at it this way. Canada is a colonial state. This country was built on genocide. And that is something that we have to face. We have to acknowledge that truth. Now, does that mean that every Canadian citizen is a viable target of violence in the decolonial struggle? Maybe some people really do believe that. And I get that there is a logic to it, but it's a logic that only ends in more and more and more violence. Maybe some people really do want to go down that road. I don't know. So, as I said in, Karmic Completions, that episode, I spoke about how I'm not against violence, period. I do think that sometimes violence is justified. And I think it's rather cruel to insist that people being oppressed ought not to be violent. So I'm not against violence, period. But if we believe that violent acts against citizens and children, and I'm not talking about one, I know I've said this in the context of those supporting Hamas, but obviously it's true for those who somehow insanely manage to warp their minds enough to believe in genocide, to believe that what the state of Israel is doing in Palestine is justified. I hope it's obvious that it's more so true for them, but I just don't think very many of those people are listening to this podcast, right? So sometimes I'm more interested in critiquing the left kind of from the left. I say kind of because I'm a little ambivalent as to whether I still want to call myself a leftist, but that's where I'm coming from for the most part, right? That's my own grounding. I've been more grounded in the left. And so I have found it to be more interesting and more important to critique the left from this position of being on the left than to continue to critique the right, because for some people, it's their role to critique the right, to, put out a sort of more, let's say, standard leftist position. But there are already very many people doing that much better than I could. And for whatever reason, I feel more called to critique the left. Maybe it's simply because my work is more about introspection and care of the self and self-responsibility. And it's absolutely not to say that external actions aren't important. It's just that this is my particular orientation, and my work in the world is more about that inner analysis and reflection. So if I'm more inclined to critique the left, it's only because I feel like that's more my role. It's not because I think there's nothing that's wrong about the right at all. So, let's agree that genocide is bad. That feels like such a massive understatement. And then it's like, okay, what do we do? Right? And one stance is an unquestioning valorization of violence. And I don't think that's the road to go down. I don't think that will benefit anyone. I think, as always, we're in a place where we're fighting each other, and it's so easy to lose sight of the true perpetrators. So, all to say, where I stand is, yes, free Palestine, end this fucking genocide, Jesus Christ. No matter what kind of warped logic you use to justify this, it's unjustifiable. And I don't think the excuse of, well, the hostages or, Jewish people, those are all just excuses to justify literal horror. But that doesn't mean that I think all Jews are bad or responsible. And it doesn't mean that I think all Israeli citizens are bad or responsible or ought to be targets of violence. So there's a time and a place for speaking directly to these things. And there are obviously many different ways to be engaged. But I think that what is maybe not often spoken about is the extent to which we actually do create change through our relationships with others, through how we engage in our everyday lives. Like, it's not just about posting on social media or writing letters or going to protests. And if you feel called to those things, great. But I believe that at least as important as all those outer actions is, first of all, doing our own healing work. Healing is a privilege in certain ways, and perhaps also a responsibility, because we know that hurt people hurt people. So as we do our healing work, we actually do change the world. It's not just a nice thing to say. It's literally true. And how we relate with others in our life is key. So how do we relate with people in a way that is just and that seeks non-violent solutions? And, many people are violent in their personal relationships, perhaps not outright through physical violence, but there are many ways to exert violence in our relationships. And to the extent that we can learn to relate with each other non-violently, at least the attempt towards it is important, and particularly when it's not necessary. And oftentimes it's not necessary, especially when we're talking about interpersonal relationships. I think ideology has a big role to play in all of this. And, no matter who we are, our ideology seems obvious to us, right? Whatever world we're steeped in seems like obviously the right way to be and think. But I think that we're at a period of history when we really need to challenge ourselves to try to see things from other perspectives. And I am not talking about, trying to see things from the perspective of someone who supports a genocide. Okay? No. But there are many, many people who see things differently from us, who are still caring, generous people. And I just think that we're past the point where strengthening our leftist position and trying to beat the right is actually an effective way to proceed. I really don't think we can accomplish anything unless we seek a allyship between what has been called the left and what has been called the right. Those who are very identified with their politics are inclined to taking the worst examples of the other side. And it's very easy to, there are some horrendous perspectives on the right, very scary worldview that many people on the right hold. And so I'm not saying that we ought to just be okay with that. But let's also notice that there are some also pretty horrendous worldviews of those on the extreme left. Maybe extreme doesn't even need to be in there. We could also pick out some examples of people on the left who hold views that we may not want to hold ourselves. And many on each side are reacting to that extreme version of the other side. So when I talk about the importance of some kind of alliance, I'm not saying that we ought to just accept these extreme views of the other side. But, when I talk to people in the world, most of them aren't extreme. Most of them aren't insane. Most of them aren't delusional. Maybe I am lucky in that I tend to connect with people who, are like down to earth, reasonable people, regardless of what their politics are. So why does that matter? Because we need numbers. Like, divide and conquer is conquering us, right? So how do we move forward? How are we going to avoid this potential ultra-violent, authoritarian control regime that seems to be unfolding? I actually think we have to be willing to find some way to collaborate with people who maybe don't see everything the way we do, but who are nevertheless reasonable people who also don't want to live in an authoritarian regime. Okay, maybe I'll come back to this topic of left-right because, again, it can, at first glance, seem like a very simple topic, but I think to really do it justice actually requires kind of sifting through things in more detail than we can do right now, because I've already been recording for a while, and I think, we've covered quite enough. I think we have to take our politics and our alliances very seriously. Like, what are we putting our energy behind? What are we supporting in the world? What kind of world are we creating through what we say, who we support, what we stand behind, what we don't say, what we believe, what we think even? Our politics is not a game. And when we support a violent politics because what we're up against is so horrendous that it seems warranted, and that's generous. I think sometimes people support a violent politics because people around you are. There can be kind of like an aesthetics to it. It's like occupying this radical, violent position. It can feel right and righteous, and it can feel warranted given the state of things. And, when things are very extreme, it can feel like it must be met with something equally extreme. And often that takes a violent form. But let's not be flippant when we support violence. It really does have an effect in the world, and violence creates more violence. So what kind of future do we really want? Okay. I feel spent. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. If you've stuck it out and you're still here, I appreciate you. I know that this is not easy to grapple with these things, but it is important. And it's important to do it with self-care, like, to not overdo it and to know when it's time to take a break and take care of ourselves. I don't even know how to say goodbye, but it is time. So goodbye and thank you. And until next time, take care. For more information, for more content, head on over to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. Until next time, take care.